All right, today we're diving into albinism. It's a really fascinating condition where genetics, biochemistry, and what we see in the clinic all come together. We're going to see how one tiny little glitch in a metabolic pathway can have this huge, visible impact. So let's get right into it.
So let's kick things off with a bit of a clinical mystery. Imagine you see a patient with exactly these features. What's the biochemical story behind it? Well, the answer lies in a single metabolic pathway that just isn't working quite right, and we're going to uncover exactly why.
So what exactly is albinism? At its core, it's what we call an inborn error of metabolism. This means it's not just about how someone looks. It's actually a breakdown in a really specific biochemical process. And in this case, that process is the creation of melanin, the pigment that gives color to our skin, our hair, and our eyes.
And you can trace the entire problem back to one single starting molecule. The body is failing to make melanin from an amino acid called tyrosine. Understanding this one connection, well, that's the key to solving our whole clinical mystery.
Okay, so before we can understand what's broken, we first need to see how the process is supposed to work, right? Think of it like a biological assembly line. Let's take a look at the blueprint for how the body normally churns out this vital pigment melanin.
The process is actually pretty straightforward. It all kicks off with our starting material, the amino acid tyrosine. Then, a super important enzyme called tyrosinase steps in and does two crucial jobs. First, it turns tyrosine into something called DOPA, and then it turns that DOPA into dopaquinone. From there, it's just a few more steps to get to our final product, melanin. When everything's working, it's a beautifully efficient little system.
Let's just zoom in for a second on the star player here, tyrosinase. It is the critical catalyst. Without it, the whole assembly line just grinds to a halt. It's also a copper-containing enzyme, and that little detail actually has some clinical relevance we'll get to. But the bottom line is super simple. No tyrosinase, no melanin.
So now that we know how the system is supposed to work, let's pinpoint exactly where that blueprint is broken in albinism. This is where we identify the real culprit in our clinical case.
And here it is, the problem in a nutshell. On the left, you see the normal, happy pathway. But on the right, in albinism, bam! We had a massive roadblock. That tyrosine enzyme is either missing or it's defective. So the conversion of tyrosine, it just can't happen. The entire pathway is blocked right at the very beginning, which means zero melanin gets produced.
I absolutely love this analogy because it makes the whole concept so clear, right? If melanin is the paint that colors our features, then tyrosinase is the artist's brush that puts it on. So when that brush is missing or broken, the canvas, our skin, hair, and eyes, is just left unpainted. It's colorless. This table breaks down the classic genetic profile for us. Albinism is typically an autosomal recessive disorder. So what does that mean? It means a person has to inherit two copies of the defective gene, one from each parent to have the condition. And most of the time, this is a mutation in what's called the TYR gene, which has the instructions for making tyrosinase. Now, it's really important to note this profile describes the most severe form, called Oculocutaneous albinism, or OCA. That's where there's a complete absence of the enzyme. There are actually other types too, like ocular albinism, where the defect is only in the eyes, or partial forms where the enzyme is just reduced, not totally gone. Okay, so we've been deep in the molecular weeds. Now let's connect all that biochemistry back to the clinic. How does this one single enzyme defect actually lead to the physical features we see in a patient?
The connection is just so direct. No melanin pigment in the skin? You get a pale or white complexion. No melanin in the hair follicles. That leads to white or yellowish hair. And in the eyes, the lack of pigment in the iris makes it look light-colored. But it also leads to photophobia. That's an extreme sensitivity to light, because the iris can't do its job of blocking extra light from getting into the eye.
Now, beyond just giving us color, melanin has an absolutely critical protective job. Its number one function is to absorb ultraviolet radiation from the sun, basically acting as a natural sunblock to shield our cells from damage. This is probably the single most important function to remember when you're thinking about the complications of albinism.
So, what happens when you take away that protective UV shield? Well, the risk of sun damage just skyrockets, and that dramatically increases a person's susceptibility to skin cancers. Since there's no cure for albinism itself, the management is all about dealing with these consequences. The focus is on just meticulous protection. We're talking high SPF sunscreens, protective clothing, and UV-blocking sunglasses are all absolutely essential. And beyond skincare, regular ophthalmologic visits for vision issues and genetic counseling for families are also key parts of long-term care. And now, let's do a quick high-yield summary. This next slide is designed to be like a flashcard, so it's perfect for a quick revision before an exam.
Okay, let's run through it. The disorder, albinism. The deficient enzyme, tyrosinase. The pathway that's affected, tyrosine to melanin. Inheritance pattern, autosomal recessive. And the key features you'll see, lack of pigment, photophobia, and sun sensitivity. And don't forget that little clinical pearl, tyrosinase is a copper-dependent enzyme.
All right, time for a quick active recall question just to lock in the information. What was that starting material, the essential amino acid precursor for making melanin?
That's right, it's tyrosine. Everything we've talked about today goes right back to this one single amino acid.
And we'll end with one last question for you to take with you. We've seen how a defect in a single enzyme can lead to the very distinct, visible features of albinism. And that really prompts a broader question for your studies. What other inborn errors of metabolism might also show up with such clear, clinically obvious signs? It's a great way to connect this one disorder to a whole class of conditions. Thanks for watching.